and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl, and it's really good to have you with us. This week we're going to be looking at a passage where only 1 out of 10 people that Jesus healed returned to him with an attitude of gratitude. Before we dive into thinking about that, however, if you've not done so already, you might find it useful to download the sheet that accompanies this study, and you can find the link to that in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet you will find the text of today's reading, some other passages you may wish to look up, the questions we'll be considering together later on, and lots of room for you to record your own thoughts and observations. And so then, without further ado, let's dive into today's passage, which comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 17, verses 11 to 19. We're continuing to work our way through the travel narrative of Luke's Gospel, which begins in chapter 9, verse 51, when Jesus sets his face to go to Jerusalem, and continues all the way through to chapter 19, verse 27, when he arrives in that city. And along the way, he's accompanied by his own disciples and very large crowds following him around. Some of those people were really enthusiastic and wanted to hear what he had to say. Others were hostile and looking for reasons to catch him out, including members of some of the other groups within the lively and diverse Judaism of Jesus' day. Now, Jesus had just given his disciples a really stern warning at the beginning of chapter 17 about not causing little ones to stumble, not causing others to stumble. And he had talked about how it was essential to keep on forgiving one's fellow disciple if they were repentant, having been challenged about what they'd done. That covers chapter 17, verses 1 to 4. And in the verses that follow, in verses 5 to 10, Jesus responds to his disciples asking for an increase of faith, presumably to help them do these really difficult things Jesus has commanded, by telling them that actually it was faith the size of a mustard seed and modest discipleship that was actually needed in that context. And that leads us into today's episode. Now, the setting is described as the region between Samaria and Galilee, so sort of the Jordan Valley area, I guess. It was more of a border than a region in its own right, separating the two areas, however. Now, some have suggested that Luke just didn't know the geography very well, but I think what he's talking about here is more theological than it is geographical. I think what Luke is wanting to say is that the kingdom of God can flourish even in those kind of borderland regions, even on the margins, as it were. So in this passage, we have Jesus teaching and healing as he went along the way to Jerusalem. And it was in these things that he proclaimed the kingdom of God. And indeed, he embodied that kingdom in his very being. In this story, we also have a group of 10 people described as lepers. Now, to talk about leprosy in the New Testament is to talk about a possible range of skin diseases. So we don't know specifically what was being mentioned. But we'll see in this story, out of all 10 of those people who were healed, only one of them would return to Jesus and give thanks. Now, Luke's Gospel was the third of the 4 canonical Gospels to be written, around 80 to 85 of the Common Era. And it forms part 1 of a 2-volume work, along with the book of Acts. When we're looking at today's passage, a healing account which is unique to Luke's Gospel doesn't appear in Mark, that Luke sometimes draws upon, and doesn't appear in Matthew. Matthew and Luke, we know, share a common source, sometimes referred to as Q. This story is unique to Luke. But we can find other passages within and beyond Luke's Gospel that it's helpful for us to keep in mind if we want to make sense of it. So an absolutely key one is from 2 Kings, chapter 5, verses 1 to 19. And that passage tells the story of the healing of Naaman, who was a Gentile suffering from a skin disease, who was healed by the prophet Elisha. And there are some interesting connections between that and today's reading. Within Luke's Gospel himself, it's useful to look at Luke chapter 5, verses 12 to 14, where we find another healing of someone with a skin disease on the road. And also to chapter 7, verse 22, where Jesus makes it clear that setting people free from skin diseases like leprosy was a key part of his work of proclaiming the kingdom of God. And that's as much as anything else, because getting something like that meant you were viewed as unclean, and that had consequences in terms of your social exclusion, as well as you struggling with whatever physical complaint that brought and the pain and suffering you would have had to endure. Recognising that we are talking about a 2-volume work, it's also helpful to look to Acts chapter 1 verse 8 and chapter 9 verse 31 to find positive mentions of the region of Samaria as an arena for the church's work and a place of growth and peace. Historical hostility between Jews and Samaritans ran very, very deep and went back hundreds of years. So in this passage, that dynamic of ethnic and religious divisions actually plays a key part, and it's fascinating that it's the outsider who will come to Jesus and be healed. Now within this passage we see some patterns that are very familiar throughout Luke's Gospel. We find in the approach of the group of 10 lepers to Jesus a plea for help, followed by a command, in Jesus' command to go to the priests, that was eminently doable. And when we look at the Samaritan who did go back to Jesus, that pattern of praise, prostration and thanksgiving is very typical of those who respond to Jesus with worship. I think what this passage is ultimately showing us is God doing the extraordinary through the ordinary and the everyday, how things often were. Now at the beginning of this section, in verse 11, we're reminded that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem ultimately, but he's taking a very strange, odd, roundabout route to do so. But as I've mentioned earlier, the setting, the geography has theological significance. It shows Jesus on the margins. And there's something in the wider dynamic of Luke's Gospel about the Gospel going out from Israel to embrace all nations, including the hated Samaritans. Now we're told that upon entering an unnamed village, Jesus was approached at a distance by a group of 10 lepers, what we hear in verse 12, and that they were keen to keep their distance from Jesus, perhaps because they thought if they got too close that Jesus would send them away. A lot of how now we understand infection and how that actually works and how diseases are transmitted was not understood so much back then, and so people tended to be excluded physically very often, and that would have shaped, no doubt, their approach to Jesus. These were people who were therefore pushed to the margins of their society, and in the case of the Samaritan person in that group, that was doubly true. They were doubly marginalised. Now it's fascinating in verse 13 that when they make their plea to Jesus, this group of people refer to him as Master. And that's significant because the only other people that we see in the whole of Luke's Gospel use that kind of language towards Jesus are his own disciples. So there's something quite telling here. And they call out to him for mercy in wanting healing, in wanting their restoration. Now Jesus responds in verse 14 by telling them that what they need to do is to follow the law of Moses and to go to the priests, presumably in the Jerusalem temple, and present themselves to show that they were indeed healed, and then the priests would be able to certify that and they'd be able to rejoin the wider community. The Greek term that is sometimes translated as healed, the Greek seskoken, could also be translated, as well as healed, as saved or made whole. And that's significant because I think what's going on here is more than just about physical recovery. There's these other dimensions at play as well. It ties in with the social dimensions, but also the spiritual dimensions of being fully restored to be part of God's people. Now, while 9 of the lepers went on their way, one of these people, we're told, recognised Jesus and gave praise to God, doxasso, and changed direction by turning around and heading back, hyperstrepho. Now, as we've already noted, the tensions between Jews and Samaritans ran very deep indeed, and so it's significant that it's the outsider who praises and returns, and also gives Jesus thanks. That stance of worship, when the leper prostrated himself in front of Jesus in verses 15 to 16, is all about worship. Worship because he has been healed, he has been set free. And it's also worth noting that the Greek word used in verse 16 for thanks is the same one, Eucharisto, that Jesus uses to give thanks for the bread and wine in chapter 22, verse 17, when he celebrates his last meal with his disciples. And it's the same term from which we get our term Eucharist, as another term for Holy Communion, a term which means thanksgiving. So there's a lot of future-looking stuff, as it were, in this passage. Now, one might read Jesus' response to the Samaritan person in verse 17 as somewhat disingenuous. It may be that the other 9 were doing exactly what Jesus had commanded them to do and were on their way to the priests to show themselves and be made clean. And it begs the question, what's Jesus getting at by saying this? I think Jesus is drawing attention to how it's really significant that perhaps the double marginalisation of this Samaritan was what made him turn back to Jesus. We can't be sure, but I think there's something here about the gospel going out already beyond the people of Israel. The man who returned and gave praise was called a foreigner, in Jesus' own words, in verse 18. And despite that term, which we might nowadays see as having a certain amount of baggage and being quite pejorative, it is still significant because Jesus is drawing attention to a Samaritan as having done the right thing. And Jews wouldn't normally hold up Samaritan people as good examples, so that in of itself is very powerful. When Jesus told the Samaritan man to rise, to stand up in verse 19, again repeating a pattern that we see in other healing stories in Luke's Gospel, he told him that his faith had made him well. Now we could translate, your faith has made you well, as also saying your faith has saved you, or your faith has made you whole. And we might look, for example, at chapter 7, verse 50, or chapter 8, verse 48, or chapter 18, verse 42, for other examples of Jesus using this phrase that can be translated in different ways. But at the heart of it, the man's faith was manifest in his glorifying God, giving praise to God, doxasso, as we saw in verse 15. That was at the heart of it and what set this Samaritan apart from the others who were healed. So there's a lot going on in this passage. I find it quite fascinating, and I hope that the questions that we're now going to look at together will draw out further interesting aspects for you.